Welcome. Hello, everyone. My name is Missy Ryan. I cover military issues for the Washington Post, and it's my great honor to be here today with a distinguished group of panelists to continue our discussion about the strategic competition facing the United States. First, I'd like to introduce our panelists, and then we're going to have a brief moderated Q&A, followed by opening it up to what I'm sure are a lot of questions from you in the audience. First of all, to my left, we have General Paul Selva, the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Christine Wormuth, Director and Senior Fellow of International Security and Defense Policy Center at the RAND Corporation, and the former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. Next, we have Robert Weiss, former Executive Vice President and General Manager of the Skunk Works, currently serving as Executive Vice President of Special Projects for Lockheed Martin Aeronautics. Finally, last but not least, we have Susanna Bloom, Senior Fellow and Acting Director of the Defense Program at the Center for New American Security. So with that, we're going to jump right in, following a very interesting and provocative presentation from Bob Work. And I'd like to start with you, General Selva. Do you agree with the assessment from the Chinese government that they will reach technological parity in 2020 and possibly technological superiority in 2030? How close to accurate is this?
Well, I think it's very clear that China's objective is to achieve parity in the early 20s and superiority in the early 30s. One of the presumptions in all of that is that we don't actually react to their ambition. And so it's very clear from our national defense strategy and our national military strategy that we intend to react to what we see as an increase both in Russia and China's desire and ambition to achieve at least technical parity, if not technological superiority. And so we have to react. Offsets are a multiplayer game. And if you accept that the Chinese are trying to offset our capability in the Western Pacific and that the Russians are trying to offset our capability in Europe, it's incumbent upon us as strategists to react to that ambition. And so inside the department today, we are working on how we might react to that capability. I am not one to discount a potential for a third offset, but my description of it is we have to assure our ability to project American power when and where it is in our national interests. And if we fail at projecting our power into situations where our interests are threatened, then we fail the American people. It's not about trying to counter an anti-access area denial strategy. That's admitting defeat up front and saying we have to go back and fix something we broke. The alternative approach is to say, analyze what your opponent is trying to do to you, make this a competition, not a conflict, and checkmate them or prevent them from getting so much of an advantage that they can prevent you from doing the things that are in your national interest. And if you read carefully in our national military and national defense strategies, as well as the national security strategy that underpins all of them, that's exactly the challenge we've given to the department. So in my job in the JROC, in my work with the technology community and our industrial partners and commercial partners who are delivering capability, that's my challenge to them. If we just sit back and don't react, we will lose our technological superiority in 2020. The Chinese are right. But we should be a player in this game, not an observer.
And just to press you on that a little bit more, what specifically is the department doing to maintain the strategic and technological edge vis-a-vis China and Russia? And what is new, if anything, under the new national defense strategy?
So a significant amount of research and development in long-range precision strike capability, significant amount of research and development in high-speed long-range precision strike. And you heard Bob Work talk about several of those as things China has already achieved. They've achieved them in micro. They haven't mass deployed hypersonics or long-range ballistic missiles. What they have done is proven the technologies. And so they are able now to deploy those capabilities at a large scale. We are behind in the demonstration of many of those technologies, but we also can take asymmetric approaches and catch back up. We're way ahead in a lot of the sensor and sensor integration technologies, and we have to maintain that edge. And so I'm fond of saying with the Chinese, you have to protect what you have, because if they can't learn about it, they'll try to buy it. And if they can't learn about it or buy it, they'll try to steal it. And we know they're active in all three domains: learning, buying, and stealing. And so we have to be careful that we defend the technologies that are important to us in all three of those domains or lines of effort, while we continue to develop additional capabilities that can be an asymmetric approach, both defensive and offensive, to the things we know they're putting on the battlefield.
So if that's the strategy, the major constraint would be the budget for that, against that strategy. To what extent is the budget a constraint, and does the U.S. military have the resources that it needs currently to deal with this challenge in the near and medium term?
So given the size of our budget, if we don't have the money to do this, then we're not paying attention. We have to put the money where it matters, and that means allocating money to research and development in the technologies that are important to achieve asymmetric approaches to both China and Russia's technology trends. And we have to do that. So with an almost $700 billion budget, if we can't find the money to do this right, then we're not actually being strategists. We're tactically reacting to a competitor's activity. And I think we need to flip that argument. We actually do need to say, so why the use of the words assured power projection is really important versus counter A2AD. I'm not countering what they're doing. I'm going to go around it. And that means we have to be able to see that battle space and understand the patterns in that battle space. We have to make sense of what we see, and we have to be able to react as quickly or faster than our opponent or our competitor in that battle space. Otherwise, this could become a crisis and become a conflict. And that's what we need to be able to avoid. So conventional deterrence is underpinned by those abilities. And those are the kinds of technologies we have to invest in. Thankfully, today, there's enough money to go around to get that work done. You will see in the next several budget cycles continued prioritization into those kinds of technologies.
And you don't think it's too late to begin investing in some of the capabilities or to increase investment in some of the capabilities that we need to be?
No, it's never. Yeah. So in a competition, it's never too late. If it becomes a conflict, the chance to invest in new capabilities and deploy them in that conflict is over. So we need to be investing today in those asymmetric technologies, in those things that impose cost on the strategy the competitor has taken in order to avoid the potential for conflict. And if we fail at doing that, if we invest in the wrong things, and they do achieve a military and technical advantage, then the potential for conflict goes up, not down. So we have to be careful that we're actually investing in the right things.
Okay. Christine, can you give us your analysis of how the Trump administration is doing on addressing the mounting strategic and technological competition from China and Russia? What is it doing right, and what is it not doing right?
Sure. I think the administration is doing at least two things right, and that's the first one is identifying both Russia and China as great power competitors. You know, as they say, admitting you have a problem is the first step, and I think this administration has definitely done that in the national security strategy, in the national defense strategy. The key now, I think, is going to be making sure that our actions live up to that recognition, and it's showing that what we're doing actually consistently and sustained over time demonstrates an approach that treats Russia and China as the competitors that they are. The other thing I think the administration has done, and this picks up on what General Selva was just saying, is providing additional resources, in particular to the Department of Defense, to invest in the kinds of capabilities that we're going to need to counter both Russia and China. I do think it's worth noting that it's not all about the military competition. Our strategy should be looking at other dimensions of our power, our diplomatic tools, our economic tools, our international development tools. And in those areas, I think the administration isn't putting the resources that we need, but at least on the military side, I think that's a positive. I think what this administration is doing wrong, from my perspective, is not playing to our strength. And our biggest strength, I think, against both Russia and China is the incredible network of alliances and partnerships that we have around the world. And those partnerships and those alliances, things like NATO, bodies like the G7, are key to maintaining our leadership role in the world and key to assuring our ability to continue to be a force for stability in Asia, for example, and continuing to present a strong and credible deterrent against Russia in Europe through NATO. And I think this administration is doing a lot of criticizing of our allies and partners. You see President Trump calling for Russia to rejoin and have the G7 become the G8 just on the heels of Russia trying to kill citizens in the United Kingdom. You see President Trump criticizing Angela Merkel, one of our closest allies. And I think, what Russia wants to do wherever it can is drive wedges into NATO. And I think China would like to also coerce our allies and friends in the region away from the United States and towards China. And unfortunately, I think some of the things that this administration is doing is actually doing some of that work for them. All of this criticism of the South Koreans, for example, about whether they're providing enough host nation support, what they're doing with us vis-a-vis trade, and frankly, surprising the South Koreans and the Japanese with things that we're doing to try to manage the North Korean problem. Those things, I think, create uncertainty and anxiety in the minds of our allies and partners. And so that's one of the biggest concerns that I have about this administration right now, is I think it's eroding the strength of our alliances from the inside.
Can you just say a quick word about Russia? You mentioned their activities in the UK, but we in Bob's presentation, we heard a lot about the challenge from China. What are the things you worry about most with Russia?
What I worry about the most with Russia is frankly the conventional imbalance that we have right now in Europe. A lot of Russia, like China, has invested tremendously in both its nuclear and conventional capabilities. And RAND, for example, has done a number of war games that show that if President Putin made the decision to try to go into the Baltics, while on the one hand, the United States, I think it's important to note, we did not stand still. We haven't stood still, nor has NATO, in the wake of Russia going into Crimea and Ukraine. We've taken important steps through the European Reassurance Initiative. But even with those advancements, and even with the things that we've done in the last couple of years, most of the war games we've run at RAND show that Russian troops would be outside of Tallinn and Riga within 48 to 60 hours. And we would be in the position, NATO would be in the position of having to essentially retake the Baltics. And that concerns me a lot. I think the gold standard of deterrence is creating enough doubt in your adversary's mind as to whether he could achieve his objectives such that he doesn't take that step in the first place. And I think there's quite a bit of work that needs to be done to get us in a place conventionally in Europe where we've created enough of that doubt. That's what I worry about the most. Many Russians and Russian experts have said to me, Putin doesn't want to go into the Baltics. He knows what the red line is. And I hope he does. But Putin, to me, is a risk taker. And we have not done a great job predicting the future when it comes to figuring out what bad guys are going to do. So I'd rather see us bulk up our forces there.
Okay, Suzanne, a question for you before we move to Rob. Can you tell us, in your opinion, is the budget properly shaped to deal with the threats that we're discussing here today?
I think not quite. And the story goes back at least to the 2012 Defense Strategic Guidance, which was a document that, yes, was a reaction to a contraction in defense resources, but did state an intention to move towards a smaller but more capable joint force. So in essence, you would trade size or numbers for some of these advanced capabilities that we've been talking about. And that was a vision that was never quite realized. If we flash forward to 2019, the current planning cycle that is just kind of coming to completion on the Hill, I think it was a bit of a missed opportunity by the Trump administration. Particularly when you look at the opportunity to both create a new strategic direction through the new national security strategy, national defense strategy, and then a significant influx of dollars to implement that new strategic direction. You see a lot of investment in the right accounts, the research and development investments that General Silva mentioned, in addition to increased procurement. However, if you look kind of down to the next line item level, what you see is very significant investment in legacy capabilities. Abrams tanks, Bradley fighting vehicles, Apache helicopters, F-18s. These are worthy and important investments, but they're not the kind of investments that are going to maintain and extend our technological advantage against China and Russia. And so, not quite, is the short answer to that question.
And what are the one or two things that we should be investing in that we're not?
I think that by and large, DoD is investing in the right things. What I see lacking is a pervasive and consistent sense of urgency. I do want to mention artificial intelligence in particular. You know, I hear it is a very, very popular topic these days, but I think in most of the rest of the national security community needs to get a bit smarter than the kind of let's sprinkle some AI on it theory. But I do believe that artificial intelligence is going to revolutionize not just military matters, but the broader economy, and the sooner we can start to understand what that's going to look like, the better. Space, and particularly offensive defense investments that prepare for war that extends into space. Again, a lot of the popular conversation envisions the kind of like James Bond Moonraker, pew pew, like, you know, in space infantry. That's not what we're talking about here.
Space Force.
But it is a very important area. Again, there's a lot of development happening in these spaces, and that's good money. What I worry about is when we look a little bit into the future, it's going to be very, very expensive to turn those developmental programs into full production programs. Mm-hmm. And I wonder about how the administration and the department are going to make room in the budget to do that.
Okay, Rob, a related question for you. What are, from a industry perspective, what are the areas of technology or weapons programs, specific programs, that you think have the best chance of, in the next 10, 15 years of maintaining that strategic edge?
Right. Well, Missy, I go back to the National Defense Strategy, and I presume most of the audience has read the document. If not, I'd highly encourage you to do so. I think it's an excellent strategy that's been outlined and prioritizes what's important to the country. A couple of takeaways that I have from considering our revisionist powers and the rogue states as well, that will be receiving a lot of the technology from China and Russia, and we'll be faced with those threats. A couple things about them. So we're talking about operating environments and environments that are contested and highly contested. We're also talking about basically an away game. So our coalition partners, as Christine mentioned, are critically important, but also in those away games, we're going to be fundamentally outnumbered. So we have to have the asymmetric capabilities that General Salva spoke to, and what that means to me is having 10-to-1 effectiveness versus those threats, 20-to-1 effectiveness versus those threats. And I think we can enumerate what some of those capabilities are. As has been addressed up here is the budget constraints. So certainly we're in a healthy budget situation in 18 and what we look forward to in 19. But it's going to be very important strategically what we decide we want to do and what we're going to decide not to do. And when I look at that list, it's really those capabilities that will provide an asymmetric capability. So I would say stealth fighters, stealth bombers, advanced weapons, hypersonics being one of those. Resilient space is important. I would go into these technology areas that need to be developed, where they remain in the R&D accounts right now. Directed energy, AI, as you pointed out. Those are areas, open system architectures, we could go on with some of those technologies and determine where the real payoff is going to be in warfighting effectiveness. So I think we've identified those areas, the payoff will come if we make the appropriate investments, but also, again, to make sure the budget is properly expended, what are we not going to do?
Well, we could continue this discussion for a while longer, but we have about 10 minutes for questions from the audience. So if people could raise their hands, I think they're... please identify yourself and just your name and your affiliation. I'm not sure if there are microphones floating around. Yes. There are. How about here in the front, Sydney?
Hi, Sydney.
There's a mic, right?
There is a mic.
Yeah.
I'm pretty loud on my own, but as you know from working with them years ago. Sydney Freeberg, Breaking Defense. To pull a thread from Bob Work's presentation, the nervous system that holds all these wonderful technologies together is the quote-unquote battle network. It's radio primarily, because you can't use landlines at sea or in the air, and usually not on a battlefield. And I noticed we spend a lot of time on cyber, but precious little talking about electronic warfare. You know, we hear DSB says we need many more billions a year on that a few years ago, Kaminsky's study. We had an EW study that was going around for a while, but basically since we retired the Raven, the Air Force hasn't had a penetrating jammer. The Navy is sort of the only ones, and Army and Marine Corps. Well, Army certainly don't have very much. Firstly, a question for General Silva, but for all of you to chime in. Is this an own goal here that we've sort of unilaterally disarmed in electronic warfare and to a large extent haven't gotten it back?
So a couple things. One, I think we assumed wrongly that encryption and our domination over the precision timing signals would allow us to evade the enemy in the electromagnetic spectrum. I think that was a bad assumption. It's not that we disarmed, it's that we took a path that they have now figured out. The Chinese and the Russians took an alternative path, which was to deploy digitally managed radio frequency manipulation, which changed the game in electronic warfare. So we have done an end-to-end study on where we are relative to the Chinese and the Russians over the next 10 years in electromagnetic warfare. And we actually call it the entire spectrum, and we've got some work to do. We've got work to do not only in the potential to use penetrating jammers and electromagnetic countermeasures against an enemy. We have to figure out alternative pathways for communications and for command and control. And so it doesn't have to be an RF game. It's an RF game because a radio frequency game. It's an RF game because we chose to make it so. And we're going to have to do some targeted investments in expanding the capacity of the networks that we use for command and control and for battle management. And if we fail to do that, we're going to lock ourselves into this force counterforce game inside the electromagnetic spectrum for the balance of the next couple of decades. We're a step behind. It's not hard to catch up, but as soon as you catch up, the fast followers will actually leap over the top of you. And that's the dynamic that's set up by having digital radio frequency management capabilities. So we have to adapt to that and adapt quickly. So the work has been done to characterize the problem. And the problem is we're locked in this point-counterpoint fight with two potential competitors who have taken alternative paths. So we have to unlock a different way to do that work.
All right, I think there was the gentleman with the white shirt, blue tie right there. Yeah, yep.
Thank you. Jonathan Ward, Atlas Organization. We work on Chinese global strategy. So I have a question just following on Secretary Work's presentation. I mean, insofar as that's the state that we're in with the improvements in China's military, the aspiration for technological superiority, I completely agree with all of that. But the United States has really had a bifurcated policy towards China for the last 20 years, which is sort of business engaged. Let's sort of build a healthy economic relationship, and defense, make sure we don't have a problem. That's come apart. I mean, now, the increases in China's military budgets, the advances in their technology, et cetera, I mean, these are all essentially coming from that policy of engagement on the business side, I think, not just by the United States, but globally. So I'm wondering, what at this point can American business, and I mean this very broadly, I mean, from defense and aerospace to technology to a range of other sectors, do to play a role towards bringing American advantage in this strategic competition rather than sort of engaging as our problems grow bigger on the security side? Thank you.
Who wants to take that? Rob?
Well, I can speak to, as General Silva pointed out, we have been making these investments in technology for a long time now. I think the signal that's informed industry has been sent several years ago, so we're not behind to the earlier question you received. So we've made a lot of advancements, as I said, in the areas of artificial intelligence, open system architecture, secure communications, resilient space, airspace integration, multi-domain command and control. The investments have been made, and I think what's important on those investments, it's always how do you get over the valley of death to create programs of record. We have demonstrated a lot of this. Experimentation is important, prototyping is important to inform where we're heading, to reduce the risks, so when these technologies become programs of record, they have a very good chance of executing quickly, to your point. So I personally am optimistic that we have what we need to move forward. And again, I think it will come back to the commitment from the nation to continue strong budgets until we can basically recapitalize what arguably has been a deferred readiness and procurement and modernization for a couple of decades, as Bob Ward stated earlier.
Okay, I think we maybe have time to just take two questions together, two final questions, and then if you could try to keep them brief. Let's see, the woman in the row back there, yep, their hand up. You want to just stand up? And then the gentleman there with the blue shirt, if you guys could both just ask a quick question, then we'll take them together.
Thank you. I'm Jean Linh Nguyen with Voice of Vietnamese Americans. Would you talk about geopolitics in our strategic competitions, maintaining of the edge? How does our allies, especially Southeast Asia, Vietnam, for example, affecting our strategy? Thank you.
Go ahead, sir.
John Gardner, retired intelligence officer, Navy. My concern is fundamental socio-political aspects as leverage in the kinds of confrontations we're talking about. We have seen how the Russians have been very adept at using our diversity as a weapon against us in the last election, particularly, but not only then. The Chinese have a serious vulnerability, in my opinion, in that they are very dependent on strict centralized control. Is there any thought being given in the command control sector, realizing that's only one of several sectors, to trying to exploit that inherent vulnerability that they can't run away from?
Okay, maybe just two quick answers. Christine, you want to take the first question?
Sure. In terms of allies and partners in Southeast Asia, that is a key part of, I think, what we should be doing to try to, we want to stay in Asia, continue to be a stabilizing force, and we want to reassure our allies and friends there that we're not going anywhere. And so I think we want to continue to reach out to all of the ASEAN countries and be building up our relationships with them, finding ways to cooperate, and particularly on the military side, continuing to form relationships. I mean, the United States has done quite a bit with Vietnam recently, with Singapore, and that's incredibly important because not only are we helping, I think, build up some of their military capabilities, but they are also giving us more places from which we could operate potentially if we needed to. So that, I think, is a key part of what we need to be doing and is a key part of our strategy. But we have to be doing that consistently over time and showing countries in the region that they can count on us and that we are going to be there for them and that they understand what the United States is trying to do. And that is where I think we have some work to do because in my assessment, we sort of swing back and forth and send a lot of conflicting signals. So I think we need to be more consistent with our allies and partners.
Okay, and on the last question of how to build in responses to cultural and sociological phenomenon, General, do you want to take that one?
So I think incredibly important in terms of the way you formulated the question, but also in the value of the human relationships that underlie those command and control networks. So it's not enough to understand how the Russians do the calculus of whether or not they'll engage in the fight, or how the Chinese try to use their whole of government approach to influence people to their way of thinking. It's what's actually going on in General Gerasimov's head, what's going on in General Feng's head. And part of that, building that human touch, is about mill-to-mill contact. And so it's not an accident that General Gerasimov and General Dunford actually communicate about what our two nations are trying to achieve in Syria. As cloudy and murky as those objectives might be viewed from the outside looking in, the forces on the ground need to have relative assurance that they're not actually going to accidentally bang into each other. So the notion of deconfliction at a strategic and operational level inside the boundaries of Syria in a fight where we're there on a set of authorities to defend Iraq and to defeat ISIS, and the Russians are there on a set of authorities and the invitation of the Bashar al-Assad government to shore up the government. We actually have to understand what the red lines are in terms of how our forces will maneuver in that space, and that is accomplished by human contact. It's General Dunford, General Gerasimov talking to each other. It's the three-star down in Al Udeid on the phone with his counterpart in Latakia, Syria, making sure that those deconfliction arrangements work. The next layer, which I think is what you're addressing, is how do they bolt all that together to make their national decisions? And the extent to which we can exploit our intelligence enterprise to figure that out, we can actually get inside of that enterprise. And I'll stop there because that would cause conflict, not competition. We have to be ready to flip that switch. If we haven't created those accesses and that understanding, we won't be ready if the day ever comes. And that's part of our deterrent strategy, is to get inside those.
All right, well, I want to thank the panel for an important, insightful discussion here today. Our next speakers are going to be discussing China's power play. So please join me in thanking our panelists and and now in welcoming to the stage CNAS's Dan Kleiman, Eli Ratner, and Elizabeth Rosenberg.
The table as we go up.